Hello, good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. I warmly welcome you to our webinar this afternoon on assessing economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic through input-output models. And I'm very glad that we have this webinar organized by the ICR Facility. But as a first, I would like to inform you that we actually are recording this webinar. So I would like to invite everyone that is not okay with that to leave this webinar, and all others, please stay with us. So first, let me say a few words on the purpose of this webinar. So the idea is today that we will share with you the potential of input-output modeling tools for assessing the economic impacts of COVID-19 on national economies. And like I'm a works expert affiliated with the GIZ, working in the field of sustainable economic development. And we had already worked together with our experts from the GWS, the economic structure research that I will introduce later, on input-output modeling tools. And then when the Corona crisis hit, we were thinking, how could these modeling tools also be used for assessing the impacts of COVID-19? And the webinar today is a result of this research and showing you how useful the input-output modeling tools can be in this regard. Because input-output modeling tools are like a very focused approach using the specific economic structures of the countries, and then understand very detailed also the sectoral disaggregation of the impacts. And in this regard, I think it is a very useful and interesting approach. So let me introduce to you our experts that we have today. So as I said, it is from the GWS, which is the Economic Structures Research Institute here in Germany. And this is a think tank that is also advising the German government on economic policy questions. And our first expert that will also give the presentation is Ulrike Lehr. And she's partner of GWS for a long time already, and since 2008, and has a large research and consulting experience, and also working in a broad range of international research projects and twinning projects of also the EU new member states and Africa. And as a second expert, we have Christian Lutz. He's the managing director at GWS, and also leading the division of energy and climate. And he will be our backup expert if there are questions. Ulrike Lehr will be the main presenter today. And before we start now in the presentation, I would also highlight that we have a chat function for this webinar. So if you have questions, please use the chat. And then after the presentation, we have time for questions and answers, and then we can use these questions that you have raised to have a discussion and work on the questions that you have developed. And the material of this presentation will also be made available to you. In the end of the webinar, you will have the chance to download them. And yeah, this is the basic background for the webinar. And now I would like to invite Stefanie Khan to introduce to you the ICR Facility, who we are very gladful is organizing this webinar series. Please, Stefanie.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. Yes, I'm Stefanie Khan. I also work with GIZ, but I'm the project manager for the Investment Climate Reform Facility, in short ICR, which is a facility which is co-funded by the EU, the Organization for African, Caribbean and Pacific States, as well as the German government and British Council. And the facility was actually started last year and is now in full speed up and running and supporting African, Caribbean and Pacific countries in improving their investment climate, improving their business environment, and also supporting business, public-private dialogue structures. It's a facility which is jointly implemented by GIZ, by the British Council, Expertise France and SNB. So we are bundling all the expertise from 4 different European member states for actually implementing this facility. And we are very proud that we are also able to deliver this, this webinar and a couple of other webinars in the last weeks already. One further next week on various topics regarding COVID-19 and how to react from a business environment, investment climate perspective. I would just like to say a little bit more about what the facility actually does, and especially for those of you who are based in African, Caribbean, Pacific country and are part of the organizations which are eligible for support from our facility. This might be interesting. So what we do mainly is that we are providing technical assistance of a maximum of up to 90 consultancy days for public and private stakeholders in the ACP, as when they want to reform the business environment and investment climate. Public stakeholders, so governmental entities, investment promotion agencies, private stakeholders could be associations, chambers, any kind of business membership organization can apply to support from our facility through a very simple request form, which you can ask for through our email address, which I think we will show later in the presentation. And the support which we can provide is in the fields of either business environment reform, so it could be reform of the tax administration, it could be licensing reform, or quality infrastructure and other topics which fall under the technical areas of business environment reform. Additionally, we are also very much looking into specific interventions which can improve the sustainability of economic growth in ACP countries. So we are also looking in how can we actually foster the business environment so that particularly inclusive business, social enterprises, green businesses, or also any kind of reform which supports gender equality are taking place. Last but not least, we believe that reform processes are most sustainable and most effective and helpful if they are underlined by public-private dialogue. So that's something else we are supporting together with the other fields, the structures and mechanisms of public-private dialogue in ACP countries. Yes, we have a couple of criteria of when we can actually consider a request, but I think I don't need to give you all the details now. If you are interested in support from the ICR facility, simply get in touch with us under the email address icrfacility@giz.de. And I will tell you also after this webinar how you can get access to a very specific modality which we set up in this COVID-19 crisis for specific support on the topic of economic modeling and input-output models. And with this, I'm handing over to Ulrike and looking forward to learn more about how input-output modeling tools can actually help us finding our way through this crisis and the economic recovery. Thank you.
Thank you both for the introduction of the field and the introduction of myself. And also thanks for the opportunity to present some of our thoughts of on assessing economic impacts of COVID-19 through input-output modeling tools. So by way of introduction, I would like to share some thoughts on the crisis itself. Then in the next part of the presentation, I will be going briefly through the theory. Oh, by the way, we should have a small poll, basically. Yes, there it is. There's a small poll, because I would like to, now that you know me, I would like to know you. And I would like to know how much experience you have with input-output modeling, or what are your views on economic input-output modeling. And I would like you to participate now. What do we have here? Okay. Okay. So are you using it in your own work? Have you read about some applications but never done it? Have you heard vaguely about it? Or don't you have any idea what is to come? All right, we have a very mixed picture. I don't have too many slides then. We have 38% who are already using it in their own work. And some people have read applications, 19% have heard about it, and 31% have no idea. This is very helpful for me to I don't know, design my presentation accordingly. So in part 2, I will be going briefly into the theory of this mysterious input-output theory. And then on the larger part of the presentation, I will show you an application. And I like to share with you our experience that we made in the application of this theory to the country of Georgia. Georgia is not in Africa, it's not eligible for any ICR money, but it is the country we, Sebastian and us are currently working in, and it's a country in Central Asia, Caucasus. Rather small country, rather severely hit by COVID-19, and you see more details later on. And in the outlook, I can also provide some insight into how can you apply this theory if you want to design recovery measures and see the impact of recovery measures too. So without further ado, this is the pandemic as I could download it end of June. And meanwhile, of course, the number of cases has already increased way beyond the 10 million mark. And also, unfortunately, the death toll has already increased. And of course, you also all are aware that the numbers I'm showing here are not necessarily the numbers of people who are sick and dying, because you have to be discovered to be sick and dying of COVID-19. So in terms of testing and really accounting, we do, I think all of us share the view that these numbers are much higher. But the pandemic already claimed almost more than 500,000 lives and really carried health system globally beyond their limits. The response the world, most parts of the world resorted to was a global lockdown, which then of course also led to a global recession and to severe economic impacts. The chart on the right side is stolen from the IMF or borrowed from the IMF. And this is a very deep recession, the deepest or worst recession since the Great Depression. And most of us have not lived through the Great Depression, so this is only stories, but it is really heavy. So in January, the world was good. The world was looking at an average global growth rate of 3.3%. And now, a couple of months later, end of June, globally, we are looking at minus 4.9, over 5% roughly. And of course, this distributes to different countries in a different way. There is global assessments of this, of the effects of the global recession. So international institutions, such as the ones I have been just showing you, provide data and assistance. But of course, also domestic institutions and domestic governments want a quick overview of these effects. They would like to have it adjustable because we are having monthly updates here and monthly changes also, and they want to have it easy to use. And this is the point where we suggest to use the economic input-output, the IO framework, for, let's say, a first overview of the effects. I mean, let's face it, no economic theory can replace own thinking. So all these economic tools, of course, can only help you think and help you decide which kind of governmental measures to take and where to lead the country. But input-output analysis can capture supply and demand shocks, and both of them are part of this crisis. But they can not only capture this, but they, like in aggregate, as an overall GDP shock, but they can also look at the structural, sectoral details and the structural effects of the economy. So applying this, in our view, helps to better understand what is happening, better design policies, and of course, enrich consultations during and in particular, immediately after this damaging phase, so to speak. And it can do so in two ways. It can do so, firstly, by using the data set and using the data and coming up with a descriptive analysis, something like a vulnerability analysis. And then in the second step, it can apply the whole approach and add to this descriptive analysis a more comprehensive analysis and more comprehensive results. And I'm taking you to my country, which is not Germany, but it can be your respective country. It's a made-up example just to illustrate to you the benefits of this approach. So an input-output table pretty much looks like this. It comprises all sectors of the economy in this example that you see here. It is agriculture, manufacturing, and services. Most of the times you have a lot more sectoral structure. For instance, in Georgia, we are having 44 sectors. Other countries like Japan have several hundred sectors in their input-output tables. I remember Algeria had something like 18 sectors and so on. So this really depends on, let's say, the richness of your local data. But in our example, we just stay with the three sectors to illustrate a little bit what is meant by input-output table. Of course, it's not only a table with words, but it's also a table with numbers. And in this table with numbers, you have a quite comprehensive picture of your economy. In your economy, you have different sectors such as agriculture, manufacturing, or the services, buying and selling different products from either the same sector or from each other. And they're also selling their products to final consumers. Let's take agriculture as an example. Agriculture is selling the value of 37 units, could be any kind of $1 million or billion dinar or something like that. So it's selling this value to agriculture. It is selling some products to manufacturing, some products to the services, and people are consuming agricultural products, and the agriculture sector also exports something. Manufacturing as well. Manufacturing sells to agriculture, to manufacturing, to be able to produce manufacturing goods, and sells to services. So you can read the table in the line-wise. You can also read the story along the columns. You have agriculture buying 37 from agriculture to be able to produce the 370 units of agricultural output. They need, for instance, they need seeds, or they need fodder for the animals. They need some machinery, some harvesting machinery, and they need, of course, some services. Everybody needs a bank and a tax consultant and services like this. Then they need to pay the people who work in agriculture. Usually that is done out of value added. And if you're lucky, you also make profit, which also would be in value added. Some things you cannot produce yourself, so you have to import it, and that all has to be covered and paid for by total output. The important thing for the usefulness and the use of this theory is that the amount of total output produced has, the rows and the columns, the sums have to be equal. So the 370 you find here, you also find here, 590 there and there, 640 there and there. What can you do with it? Well, you can look at it first and try to understand your economy once it is delivered in such a framework. For instance, in this country called my country, services contribute 40%, agriculture contributes 23%, and manufacturing contributes 37% to total output. So this is a more or less service-oriented society. It's an economy which imports little and exports little. The example, by the way, is taken from a EU handbook on input-output table, which is given as a reference at the end of this presentation. So the main uses on this side lie in consumption, and the economy is highly interdependent. What does that tell us? Well, when you are trying to analyze the effects of something like the COVID-19 crisis, or any other crisis for that matter, the descriptive analysis can be used to determine vulnerabilities. If you have a high share of consumption in the economy, then that, of course, it makes you much more vulnerable for demand shocks. If consumption is really important in your economy, then the closing of stores for a long time is really, really bad news. If, for instance, like Germany, you are exports do have a high relevance in your country, then you are very vulnerable for global demand shocks. So the lockdown in a lot of our partner countries was really bad news for the exporting industries in Germany, such as the automotive industry, to name just one example. If your country is highly depending on tourism, obviously, you are extremely vulnerable to travel bans. Energy import or export dependence, if your country is highly dependent on energy imports, then maybe low energy prices, which are also a consequence of this crisis, may be good news for you. If you have small-scale farmers, for instance, who are living on subsistence level, they depend on local markets and they depend on the ease of domestic travel. So the possibility to go from the village to the next town, for instance, to sell their goods. And the lockdown hits these vulnerable groups most. Also, of course, earlier today we have been discussing these things with French-speaking participants, and there was the question of if you have large share of, let's say, day labor and informal labor. And we've seen from a lot of countries that these vulnerable groups are also hit very hard by this crisis. So having looked at this table, I think it is time to acknowledge the person who has invented it, who is Wassily Leontiev. He has invented this framework of data collection and of showing the interdependence of different economic sector. And he also came up with an equation that is used in the input-output analysis, the Leontiev equation. So Wassily Leontiev has received the Nobel Prize in the year 1973, and he has developed this tool, the input-output tables, for the analysis of direct and indirect effects. Currently, they are, at least I'm aware of, data sets which comprise input-output tables for more than 100 countries in the world. Lots of statistical offices are developing it, are using it, are updating it, and lots of statistical offices are either providing input-output tables or supply and use tables. And to understand the rest of the presentation, just keep in mind there's a way of turning one into the other. So once you have a supply and use table, you can do all the steps that I'm suggesting and presenting here. It is a consistent analytical framework to estimate the effects of economic shocks on output, gross value added, employment, and GDP. It maps direct and indirect effects, and it allows for, let's say, a deeper insight into economic structure effects. And the examples that I will be presenting from now on are focusing on demand shocks for the sake of an example. So what this approach can do is it focuses on damages and losses by sector. It helps you to understand vulnerabilities by sector, and it helps you to prioritize sectors, for instance, for recovery or for support measures. And we are suggesting this as a stepwise approach, where step one then lies in the identification of the sectors which are affected. Step two, which is like pointing the finger at the sector. Step two then is quantification of the damage, of the loss of the global and national demand changes. Step three will then be the application of Mr. Leontiev's equation to this vector of demand changes. And step four is the comparison of results. Step four is a step that you should always do when you do empirical work, which is talk to the experts and talk to your colleagues and talk to or look at the literature and see what other people have thought and done on similar questions. For instance, I did look at some of the stuff that Cambridge Econometrics did, and I think there's somebody from Cambridge Econometrics right now in the audience. So step one, identification. And we want to illustrate here these four steps by taking you through the example calculation for Georgia. And bear with us because you will find a lot of similarities, I think, even between the restrictions and the effects in Georgia and your own country. And I'm happy to discuss in the discussion session, in the Q&A session, then what is similar and what is different. The sectors affected by the pandemic. On the two pictures, for those of you, on the two pictures, you see on the upper picture a street which is usually teeming with people having fun and going to restaurants, because those are all restaurants with outside chairs and having a lot of fun. And now it's sitting there very bare and empty because everything was locked down. And Georgia had really severe restrictions of movement during the lockdown. Even people were not allowed to move within Georgia, from town to town, from village to village. And you see here police and also military control of passengers, and only passengers who had some very good reasons were allowed passage. This lockdown then nationally led to the decrease in demand for transport, for restaurants, retail, all the shops were closed, administration, and also, of course, for fuel, because if you don't drive, you don't consume fuel, and also for durable consumption goods. From the international travel side, of course, tourism was impossible. Migrant workers, people from Georgia several people from Georgia work in construction, for instance, in Russia. It was impossible to travel. Then a lot of people work in healthcare internationally, aged care, caring of the elderly, for instance, in EU countries or in Israel. So you also had to face losses of remittances, and generally you had interruptions in the international value chains. And tourism not only decreased from abroad, but also within the country, because people were not able and not allowed to move. So how do you quantify something like this? How do you quantify and find indicators for these lockdown effects? Well, if you do have data, then of course it is the simplest way of approaching this is to compare the number of tourist arrivals, for instance, in spring in Georgia to the same period the year before. Sometimes, of course, you have to take into consideration, in particular in countries that are developing their tourism currently, they have been foreseeing increasing numbers of tourists. So the comparative loss is even larger, not only compared to the number last year, but also to what had been expected for this year. The same with trade. In trade, you have to, well, there's different ways of quantifying the indicator for trade. You can look at your trading partners, your trade partner countries, and see and try to find out how far they went into lockdown. So if somebody who buys your product doesn't allow any influx of, be it goods or people, into the country, then you are sure to lose this part of trade. Also, the order level, of course, which can be asked from your respective industries, is a sure sign then compared to last year or to a projection for this year. The exchange rate plays a role. For instance, the Georgian currency lost value, but since their trading partners were also in lockdown, they were not really able to realize the benefits on the export side. But since they were still importing, for instance, fuel or some other goods, they had to pay more for it due to a higher exchange rate. In retail, to quantify the effects in retail, it is, again, one way is to compare the turnover this year with the turnover in the same period before the lockdown. And when you look at retail, of course, you have to make a difference between some consumption that can be made up. So clothes, shoes, books, things like this. Some people tend to buy more once they can go to the stores again. And some consumption just cannot be made up. Restaurant visits. You can only go to restaurants, and at least I can only eat a certain amount. I cannot eat twice as much just after the lockdown. The sources can be a wide variety of sources. I mean, yes, it's very good news if you do have statistics, but it can also be newspaper clippings, literature, surveys. So if you want to get a first estimate with the help of the input-output table. I mean, the input-output table should be statistics, definitely, but the estimation of the effects, it can be pretty much everything, because it is important that you get an understanding of what is going on in your country. But other than that, there is no requirement that you have like really wait for really sound and solid statistics, because what you do here is really a quick approach and a first overview of effects. Applying this to Georgia again, we found that Georgia is experiencing a loss in real GDP growth rate of -4.5%. And we are well in sync compared to the literature. In the upper part of this picture, I hope you can see it, you find some global growth projection, and you can see how it goes from February, where even some estimates were positive, over to March, April being negative and more negative. And for Georgia, the Georgian research institutions and the Georgian ministries came up with a 4 to 5% real GDP decline in 2020. So we are well in sync with the literature, but what can we do more? Well, what is a little additional, and also presenting this to the Georgian ministry, we got the feedback that the additional benefit that is highly valued there are the additional insights regarding sector employment and sector-specific losses and indirect effects. So we can actually say who is losing how much after including all indirect effects. And of course, hotels and travel agencies and tour agents are experiencing the largest loss here. But you see also other manufacturing, agriculture, financial and business services, public services. You see the losses very disaggregated. And through this mechanism of if one sector in the economy loses turnover, loses business, then all the sectors that are delivering to him are also losing business. This effect is included, and it leads to some kind of multiplier effect. So $1 million lost leads to, in one sector, leads to 1.8 or something million dollar lost in all the other sectors too. Then, of course, this sectoral view helps to target recovery measures to the most vulnerable groups. The relative losses are largest here in the tourism-related sectors. Absolute loss in agriculture is also relatively high, but compared to the whole turnover of the agricultural sector, relative losses are rather small. Manufacturing losses are above average, and also construction is hit by lockdown and the COVID-19 crisis, also through indirect effects, of course. How about recovery then? I mean, it's one thing to understand the crisis, and it is important to target recovery then to the sectors that are hit most. And now we are approaching, at least, or are in the beginning of the phase where lots and lots of countries are designing recovery measures. Like the EU, for instance, has just finalized or is just arguing about their package for recovery. And the IMF has actually come up with an interesting website where they collect the policy responses to COVID-19. So if you want to go through this, it is rather interesting to see what the other countries do. And when you browse through this, you see that recovery measures globally, of course, do something that governments can do very quickly, which is tax breaks, loans, and subsidies sometimes are not as quick. But that is, of course, a relief from governments to businesses and citizens that is done rather quickly. And the overall economic effects of this are better included in a full economic model that also includes price effects and monetary effects. However, one really important category also of governmental recovery measures is investment support, because we not only want to provide relief, but we also want to get out of the crisis. And of course, getting out of the crisis also is helped by investment and by investment support. And here the input-output approach then can help to quickly analyze what can be an effect of such investment support. Going back to Georgia, where we will be looking into the recovery measures in the next couple of weeks. For instance, in agriculture, the set of recovery measures in Georgia has several incentives and investment, and in agriculture, they are planning on investment support, investment in equipment, for instance. Georgia is currently having a large agriculture sector, which is not very modern, and there have been plans already before COVID-19 to improve, let's say, the efficiency, to improve the technologies, to take the whole agriculture sector a couple of years to the future, to make it just better. And now the COVID-19 recovery measures are combined with this overall idea of improving the agriculture sector. And the effects of these recovery measures can be included into the input-output model by, for instance, if you have an investment in more modern equipment, that in the input-output logic will be a demand change, will be additional demand from, if you remember my input-output table, additional demand for the manufacturing sector, because the manufacturing sector is manufacturing the investment goods. If you improve production technology, which is up here, irrigation systems, greenhouses, and so on, then that could be a change in the very coefficient of the technology in the input-output logic. And if you introduce international standards in some sectors of agriculture, which is down here, you of course increase the opportunities on international markets once they are open again. So you increase the international demand in the input-output logic. As you see, or this shall serve, or I hope this serves as an example to illustrate how you can also include recovery measures and make estimates of the economic effects. The economic effects in terms of results, you can find them in terms of changes in output, changes in employment, and changes in value added. So, I'm coming to an end. We do believe that the use of economic input-output framework helps to get a first overview of effects, in particular in environments where you have to react quickly, where you want to have a quick and rapid first impression. The framework maps direct effects and indirect effects, so it does not only address the direct losses of retail or direct losses from not having tourists in your hotel, but it also maps, which is the tip of the iceberg, but it also maps the hurt that is experienced, for instance, from agriculture sector selling to the hotels, because if the hotels do not have any tourists, then they don't buy anything from the agriculture sector, and all these multiplier effects are included in this framework. It helps you to identify the vulnerable sectors and groups, and it can show how recovery measures can support the economy and secure jobs. The framework, of course, is not made for COVID-19. In the early part of the 20th century, Vasily Leontiev, although he was a very visionary person, he did not foresee COVID-19. It can be applied to a lot of other topics. For instance, together with Sebastian and my colleagues here in GWS, we are applying it to questions of climate change and questions of climate change adaptation. Also developing a full model to deal with this type of questions. So these are the references I have been pointing out to you. There's two very, very useful handbooks on input-output tables with extensions and applications, and my numerical example has been taken from the Eurostat manual. And with this, I would like to give the floor back to, I think it's Stefanie, and to thank our Sebastian, looks like Sebastian, and to thank you for your attention so far. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ulrike. I think this was an excellent presentation, highlighting again why we wanted to feature this IO approach as a very useful tool to deal with the economic aspects of the COVID-19 crisis. Because, yeah, as you said, it is really like an evidence-based tool to enable countries to better understand what are the effects for the specific economy and how to react and how to plan, because as it seems, COVID-19 is there to stay with us for some time, and economies increasingly need to plan their responses. But to plan well, we need to first understand the impacts. So with this, I would like to give over the floor to the audience and invite you to raise questions that you have and share with us what is the most relevant for you and where you would like to have some more information also from our experts. For raising questions, the chat function is open for you.
I don't believe it was all clear. So maybe I do something nasty and ask the audience to, maybe somebody wants to share their own experience for their country. You can also, you don't need to write, you can also talk, I think. There's some movement. Okay.
Like one question that I think would be very interesting is to understand how we can apply this approach in a country that does currently do not have an IO table and an IO modeling team. So how easy is it to have this supply and use table, which is existing in more countries, to develop in such an IO framework? I think that is one aspect that would be important to understand, right?
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, there's three basic situations where you may find yourself in. Either you have an input-output table that is very recent, which is okay, you just go ahead and do the calculation. If it's not so recent, you have to think about your country and the structural change that has been going on since the last input-output table has been issued, but that is fairly easily doable. The next situation is, of course, you are in a country that has supply and use tables, fairly recent. We were in this situation in Georgia, and we have developed an Excel-based tool to convert supply and use tables into input-output tables under the three most commonly suggested approaches from the literature. So this is depending on the material that you have and on the consistency of sectors, this is fairly easily doable. So if people are interested in discussing that, for instance, in the one-on-one session, we are more than happy to share our experience, give assistance to this, and so on. And the third situation is you have neither. Then you can still resort to large international databases who have been compiling input-output tables for a large number of countries. Yes, a large number of countries, and so you can use this international framework for your respective countries and still do the analysis. Richard is just pointing out that I talked unusually little about jobs. So for people who know me, usually I talk about jobs and green jobs and all these things. So yes, I can say something about the implications for jobs as well as for output. I just brought the results for neither, I think. But no, we had the results on output. I showed you the results on output. And depending on, let's say, the labor intensity of the respective sector, you have either the same impact on jobs or you have an over proportional impact on jobs. So usually in the service sectors, for instance, which is part of the tourism and travel related sectors, you lose even more people lose their jobs than you lose output. It is over proportionate, so to speak. And of course, the input-output framework gives you an information on, it translates output loss into, or value-added loss into job loss. It cannot say that you maybe in your country, for instance, like Germany, you have some governmental measures that keep people in their job, but they, earn less for the time being, for being laid, not really laid off, but it's called short labor. And so that the tool does not cover, but it helps you to understand how many jobs will be lost in the respective sector and then in the economy as a whole. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, just briefly to add on this, I think that is really a key advantage of the approach to highlight for the national economies, like which sectors of the population are hit most, because jobs are like a key concern, right? And so there's the next question on Build Back Better. So Ulrike, can you?
Build back better. That's not so much related to the tool. It's more related to the COVID-19 recovery measures, which then, of course, will show again in the input-output table after all this has been done. So I think I illustrated it a little bit with the example from agriculture in Georgia. The agriculture sector in Georgia is coined by lots of subsistence small-scale farmers, and the Georgian government has already, let's say, discovered this as being a problem and already started the respective measures. Now they are trying to combine, and that is, I think, what this Build Back Better headline is about. They are trying to not come back to the original status in agriculture, but to use the recovery measures to get an improved agriculture sector in the end. And of course, with the combination of looking at the table as it was before in terms of efficiency, in terms of materials used, in terms of input, and defining your new sector where you want to go in terms of efficiency and in terms of material input, the input-output approach can help you to define this path, or to at least give some information about this path. If you want to come from an agriculture production that uses mainly physical labor and doesn't use lots of irrigation, doesn't use lots of greenhouses and so on, the input structure is quite a lot different compared to a more modern agriculture sector, which uses modern irrigation. They will have entirely different economic structure, and you can actually think about this in terms of input-output coefficients and identify where you can target some of the recovery measures. I think you can.
Yeah. I think just to add briefly, like one thing we are discussing in Georgia is to have like scenarios, like of how also the recovery measures could go. And so this would be like you could compare an approach on building back better or building back business as usual, right? So I think that is a possible approach.
Yeah.
What would be great, like to hear like from the audience also some experiences, just as Ulrike, you mentioned, like how are you dealing with the economic effects, and which modeling tools have you been using? If there's someone willing to share the experience, I think this would be great. You can also raise your hand, and then we invite you to speak.
How about South Africa, for instance? Maybe didn't join. I saw in the participant list there will be some participants from South Africa.
So,
oh, there are raised hands. I see raised hands.
Yes, please.
Oh my God, since it was 30 minutes, we missed something here. Margaret, speak.
Hi, Ulrike. Hi, colleagues. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent presentation, Ulrike. Thank you so much. I was just wondering, thinking about building back data, would you recommend a static model like the one that you are using now? Or would you perhaps have something more dynamic? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very good question, of course. And I think the static model is a little bit underestimated. So I'm trying to promote looking at what you have, if you do have supply and use tables, and if you do have, or if you do have an input-output table, then what I think this presentation is going after is make good use of it. because it is rather straightforward. Of course, on the midterm or longer range and longer term, I think everybody agrees that a full economic model, which by the way we are doing for Georgia, is very useful to have as a policy analysis tool. Also because then, of course, you can capture more price mechanisms, you can capture the effect of taxes, you have even more feedback loops within the economy, and so on. But I think the input-output analysis as a first overview tool is still underused. More comments on that? Sebastian, maybe we go then to the one-on-one. Maybe people are less shy when it comes to the one-on-one and approaching the experts directly.
Exactly. Maybe Stefanie, please, you can explain to the participants which further support is possible in this regard.
Yeah, thank you very much. So if any of you have more questions and would like to discuss in more detail your individual case, maybe in your country you already have an input-output table and would like to discuss with Ulrike how you can look at this from a COVID-19 perspective, we are offering so-called one-on-one clinics. They are open for public and private organizations based in ACP countries. For this particular topic, we are also opening it to think tanks, which are not normally in our direct target group, but I think it would be very, very good also if we can support think tanks in using this information and maybe then advising their respective governments in the COVID response. So public and private organizations, including think tanks, are invited to apply for one-on-one clinics in which you can just remotely discuss with Ulrike and her colleague about how to use input-output tables in your work related to COVID-19. If you send us an email to ICR Facility at gz.de, we will see how much demand there is and therefore how many sessions we can provide you with. But based on experience, if you are interested and you are one of the eligible organizations, then there's a good chance that we can actually arrange a session with Ulrike and her colleague. And yeah, just to let you know, because we are financed by the EU and the OACPS, we are also always making sure that we reach a regional balance across the ACP countries. But I'm just looking forward to hearing whether you and your organization have an interest to exchange. Then please get in touch through ICR Facility at gz.de, and then we can see how we can support you further. I can see that there is a question. No, I think there wasn't any additional questions. So if you have further questions which you would like to raise right now, please raise your hand or write us in the chat questions on that one-on-one clinics and how to reach us, or further questions on the topic. You are welcome to come in still, and otherwise I think we are going to close this webinar and looking forward to your responses. Sebastian, back to you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing this opportunity. Maybe for some of you, you have a look at the material and the approach that we shared with you, and then if there comes more questions with you, or you share this with your partner, please get in touch with us, and the ICR facility, and we are very happy to support you further in this regard. So, well, if there are like no direct follow-up questions, the floor is still yours. The audience, please raise your hand if you have a specific aspect that you would like us to focus on now. If this is not the case, I would close this webinar by first thanking all of you